Hey everyone, today we're ranking every weapon in Apex Legends Season 19. There have been quite a bit of meta changes since my last iteration of this video, and we have a lot to talk about, so let's waste no time and get right to it. This is all just my opinion based on my experience in-game, but for me, there are no F-tier weapons which would be absolute trash or dumpster fire to use. They're simply just bad aim. So we start with the D tier, which are the underwhelming, poor, and what I refer to as the give me absolutely anything else please. Per usual, this is reserved for my favorite holder of attachments, the P2020. The 20 actually has a nice total damage per mag, but really beyond this, it's nothing more than just the weapon you have to use early on in game if you find nothing else. If you magically manage to find a hammer point and a P20 off the drop, then this P shooter can act more like a very low C tier weapon, but otherwise, I'm dropping it the first chance I do get. Slightly topping the P20 for me is the Devotion at D+. The Devo actually saw a slight buff this season as the turbocharger no longer has the effects of lowering the damage per round by 1. However, this thing requires so much for it to actually be useful. You need to have a mag to really make it be effective. You need a barrel stabilizer because the recoil is absurd, and a stock is also very useful as it's an LMG with abysmal handling if you are in a one-on-one with an R9. Don't forget you'll need a purple bag and a massive amount of ammo since the Devo also chews through ammo like nobody's business. If you do get the Devo in a turbo and you want to push very aggressively, it can have some use cases as the TTK is decent to good. However, it really lacks range, any sort of handling, and something like the Havoc is a much better option in terms of flexibility and overall power. We've got a couple weapons in the fine or okay category of C tier. The first is the Mozambique. The Mozambique for me always takes the top spot between this and the P20 because simply, the Beak is actually a pretty fine weapon. It has more of a chance to swap to and one-tap someone down, which is what you would want from a secondary. If you manage to get hammer points, it does become very comparable to an EVA 8 in terms of its damage per hit. However, the big thing the Beak has over really all of the other shotguns is going to be the range. You can do a full 45 damage or 60 body hit up to 45 meters away, which is a massive distance for this type of gun. It also acts like a mini wingman, which is even more the case since now the wingman is in the care package. Like the P20, I give it a C+ or B- rating with hammer points as it does give it more power. The trio of hammer point weapons caps off the C tier, and this is the RE45 at C+. The RE has the biggest potential to actually function as a decent secondary, but similarly to the Devo, it does need to be fully kitted. Many people do swear and live by the RE45, but the truth is, the fire rate isn't close to that of an R9, and the DPS or TTK is also quite low, comparably to both an R9 and a car SMG. The best thing that this pistol does have is the handling, which means if you want the fastest gun in the Outlands for speedy movement, which makes you elusive 2-track in a close range fight, then this thing actually is okay. I personally do not mind running a sniper with the RE45, so I can have this very fast swap to and very fast strafing speed, but as a whole, I'd much rather have an R9. We now have a fair amount of weapons in the B tier, which are the good and decent, but generally they are going to miss out compared to their higher tiered alternatives. Our first sniper rifle to make the list is on deck, and it is the Charge Rifle. The Charge Rifle and really all snipers had some buffs this season, but the Charge really only has one singular use, and it's that mega long range damage, which kind of requires you to be in more open areas. Luckily, the map rotation of Storm Point being so prevalent will help its use case, but at the end, Apex Legends is king when it comes to close range fights, as eventually that ring is going to shrink down. If you get pushed with a Charge Rifle in your back pocket, you really are going into a fight with one weapon, which is also a big disadvantage as the Charge is pretty unusable at anything within like 50 or so meters. The Charge is still fun to get that huge 200 plus hit at 300 meters, but enemies have to be so far away and you aren't really going to be able to capitalize on this big damage, which means the Charge Rifle is purely the weapon to use to farm damage in the early to mid game, and then you really have to swap off of it later on towards the end of the match. Completely switching gears, we have the Alternator also in B tier. The Alternator for me slipped a little bit from last season. I thought Disruptor rounds were going to make it a little bit better, but this was not really the case. The Alternator is also placed fairly low when you are comparing it to the other weapons in its class, because when it comes to an SMG, you want the fastest time to kill, which the Alt does not have. What the Alternator does have going for it is its capabilities off the drop. It's easy to use and also has a decent base mag size with a high damage damage per round, which means when you have a lot of gray shielded enemies around, the alternator is pretty good in this environment. The alternator has some capabilities later on if you do want to run it with the 2x, as virtually no recoil does make it very easy to handle, and having the flexibility between close to mid-range is pretty nice, but as a whole, this gun just lacks that offensive DPS, which is going to keep it pretty low. Our second LMG of the list is going to be the Spitfire, but it also is the first B+ weapon. The Spitfire can have some moments where it really does impress, but the fact is, the Spitfire's time to kill is very low when you are at the range where it excels. Other weapons like the Nemesis 301, Flatline, Hemlock, and so on are going to simply just outdamage it. The Spitfire is good for overall damage output, and when you have a lot of enemies grouped up together, or if you are in a multi-team fight, the Spitty can be pretty reliable. However, its close range viability is pretty abysmal, and even with its hipfire buff of a season or two ago, it's just not that good. If you want to run something that is a little bit different from the typical meta, then this is an option, but I still would look elsewhere if you want an LMG option in Apex. B+ is the tier of seconds, and we now have the EVA 8 shotgun. The EVA is surprisingly viable if you are diving straight into a team fight, as the total damage output it can do is very good at just under 450, which does mean in a perfect world, you could almost take down 2 fully healthy red evoed enemies. However, the EVA isn't going to pack as much firepower per shot, which does leave it a little lackluster at times, and it also does not have as good of range as the PK, or of course the Mozambique and even the Mastiff. The reload is also very slow, which means you are basically completely out of a secondary when you do run out of ammo mid-fight. It's also worth taking a second to mention that while shotguns in Apex are semi-meta or semi-competitive, SMGs are really just reigning supreme right now, as it's hard to beat out something like a CAR or an R9 that can have you go from 225 to 0 in literally under a second. Locking in our final B+ spot is the longbow sniper rifle. If you are an OG, you probably remember the Season 1 and Season 2 days where the longbow was a heavy weapon and it completely was dominant, but we are long removed from those days. The only thing the longbow has going for it right now is going to be its ease of use and overall flexibility at all ranges, not to mention it can also take a sniper optic, which could be okay on occasion. However, the longbow does not have that same quick damage output as the 30-30 or the harder hitting power of the Sentinel. I think the only reason you truly would want to run a longbow is going to be if you want to split up ammo types from your team, as if you are looking to run it for its very long range capabilities, I think the charge rifle is going to be the better choice, but that of course does not have the flexibility of the longbow. As we move on to A tier, be sure to drop a comment down below with what weapon you think needs buffs the most, and don't forget to hop into my community Discord if you have any Apex questions, want to find others to play with, or if you are just looking for a spot to hang out. Also, a like on this video is greatly appreciated. These videos take a ton of time to make, and your support does mean a lot to me. A tier for me is where the weapons really start to become usable, and honestly, you cannot go wrong with any of the guns in this tier, which I deem to be great and amazing. The Volt is going to be first, which may be surprising as it is a very good all-around weapon, but there's a continual trend when it comes to SMGs, and it is when the SMG cannot compete with a few others, it's just not worth recommending or putting above other weapons. Not to mention, the Volt is in the crafter for the first half of the season, which I think means we will rarely see this thing in the battlefield. If you want an SMG that is similar to the alternator but has a little bit better time to kill, then the Volt is a really good option. Also, if you are struggling with recoils of the CAR or an R9, then the Volt is again a good middle ground option between the recoil control and the TTK, which I think most people are definitely going to still find success with. My personal favorite LMG is up, and it is the Rampage. The Rampage for me mixes together the best perks between something that is fairly competitive in the TTK, incredibly easy to use, shoots super slow, which means it conserves ammo, and also has an insane total damage per mag or damage per round. The Rampage will require a thermite to be competitive in the close range, which is the biggest turnoff for me, but if you want to farm up something like an Evo shield, still be fairly good at longer ranges, and you are not a fan of marksman type weapons, then this is an option for you. Overall, I don't think this is the right choice if you want the most meta experience, but I'm a big fan of the Rampage and Ranked, where slower paced engagements will allow you to take advantage of what this gun does bring to the table. Almost in the opposite sense, the G7 for me is a weapon that has fallen down quite a bit, both in terms of my favorableness towards it and its competitive nature compared to the others in its class. I do think the G7 is the most flexible of the marksman weapons, which does mean you can have some good results in the close range hipfire or of course mid-range damage farming. I think it lacks raw damage output that the triple take provides, as the TT can nearly do a 100 damage per headshot, and as can the 30-30. But if you want that damage farming weapon with more flexibility on the closer side and is a little bit more forgiving because it does shoot fast, I think the G7 is still a great weapon to pick up. The Mastiff for me is another weapon that is worthy of an A spot, and it actually provides a very specific benefit that we do need to discuss. The Mastiff really mixes together the power of a PK and the fire rate of an EVA, so if you lack precision of that PK user, but you want a little bit more power than an EVA 8 user, the Mastiff is probably the right choice for you. But this actually isn't even what I was alluding to, and what I think the Mastiff brings to the table over the other shotguns is its ability to reload one round at a time. This means a multi-team fight or multi-enemy fight, you will have the power to keep your damage output up. This means less downtime, and when you cannot afford to reload a whole mag, the Mastiff is there to save the day. Switching gears back to marksman, we now have the triple take. The triple take, in my opinion, is probably the most slept gun in Apex Legends right now, especially considering the hipfire of the 30-30 was nerfed. The triple take can kind of just do it all, but it lacks one thing, and it is going to be speed. Having to wait for the choke every time means you're either reducing your damage output or reducing your accuracy if firing in rapid succession, but sometimes you really don't need the extra range that the choke does bring. The triple take is something that acts like a mini EVA 8 in close range, which I think is underrated, as knowing that you have something with both close and mid-range flexibility, but also having the damage that is near a sniper rifle is pretty huge. Our final straight A tier rating in the last ground sniper rifle is the Sentinel. For me, the Sentinel is the best sniper to use if you want that hardest hitting weapon that has the best chance to knock enemies, and this weapon is not named the Kraber. The Sentinel is very useful in close ranges, which means it can kind of act like a peacekeeper as well. It requires you to be very accurate, and if you do miss a shot, this is a big deal if enemies are too close, and if you do struggle with your aim, the previous triple take would probably be a much better choice, as this is way more forgiving. While this list is for the best guns and not a fun tier list, I think it's worth giving a mention that the Sentinel does provide a very fun and satisfying experience in Apex, which you can't really get with other guns. If you do want to have a good time, which is what games are all for, then try it out. We now have a ton of weapons at A+, which are borderline that must use S tier for me. We are going to start off with the returnee to the ground, the L-Star. The L-Star is a very good gun this season. It obviously is not as good as the care package version, but it's better than what was previously on the ground. The TTK isn't too bad, although it's still below its competitors in that mid-range category. The L-Star's unique feature of the no reload does allow for some pretty solid consistent damage output, but it's not quite in the S tier for me because of its slower TTK, and more importantly, it's an LMG, which again comes with all those negative perks of poor handling and strafing speeds. However, if you want a pretty reliable mid-range beamer, the L-Star is good, but I also find it uses up ammo way too fast for my liking. The final shotgun, and what I deem to be one of the premier secondary weapons, is obviously going to be the PK. The Peacekeeper is not necessarily going to wow your opponents with those one mags, but if you want to play very aggressively with an R9 or an SMG in the primary and back it up with this shotgun, you can do some pretty magical things, not to mention a PK in the back pocket to an assault rifle is also pretty good if you need to conserve bag space, which more times than not is a wise decision in ranked, or if you are trying to play with a legend who needs more grenades like Fuse or Horizon. The PK with disruptor rounds is pretty crazy to tap fire from longer range to mid range, because you are going to be able to chunk up shields, which can be pretty reliable to do. Our first care package weapon is going to be the Bocek. The Bocek, similarly to the other mid to long range weapons, saw a buff this season which revolves around the draw speed and shatter caps. I do not think, however, this really changes things that much. I simply do not put the Bocek in S tier because it really does not have that much ammo for a care package weapon. You will run out if it's anything beyond the very late game, which is a big deal, but if you want one of the most reliable mid-range poking weapons and you get it pretty early on in a game, it is worth grabbing. Second to the Bocek is the Kraber. The Kraber I still just cannot put in S tier, as ever since its nerf to headshot damage pretty much means you will never get a one tap later on in games if anyone has a purple armor and a purple helmet, or a red armor and a blue helmet. The Kraber as a whole though is still absolutely worth picking up, as the damage it can do is very penalizing, and anyone who can capitalize on this entry damage should easily be able to make work of a squad. One Kraber body shot requires you to both pop a battery and a med kit, which in turn slows enemies down for 10 to 15 seconds, which is plenty of time to capitalize by either pushing them or getting yourself some time to breathe. The old top dog is also in A+, and it is the R301. Surprisingly, the 301 went into the crafter, and for me, the R3 acts very similarly to the Volt in terms of its performance to the other ARs, like the Volt is to the other SMGs. The R301 simply just does not have the damage output that it used to, and because of this, it just is out outclassed nearly in every other category other than its ease of use or reliability. Because these two things aren't necessarily objective and are more player specific, I can't rank the R301 any higher than its counterparts. If you want a very reliable experience and if you are struggling with recoil control, then this is absolutely still going to work great for you, as it's one of the best performing guns that you can use for the skill required to excel with it. Edging out the R301 for me is going to be my favorite weapon in the game, and it is the Flatline. It's been a while since the Flatline has not been in S tier, if ever, for my ranking, but the reality is the Flatline again does not have enough damage per second to compete with the Nemesis or the Hemlock. What the Flatline does, however, is a very generous damage per mag, both at its base and 30 round level 3 mag. It shoots slower with more recoil, which does mean its total damage per mag is also very high, which can make it pretty reliable in a 1-on-2 scenario, or if you need to conserve ammo since it does shoot slower. It won't have the same range output due to that higher recoil, but the Flatline remains one of the top pickups, and it's again something that you can't go wrong with, especially if you do not like burst weapons. Our final amazing and must-use weapon is going to be the returnee to the top, and it is the Havoc Assault Rifle. I have a lot to say about this gun, but the straight up fact is that the Havoc combines SMG-like use cases packed into an assault rifle, and in some sense makes it one of the best guns that you can use. As we outlined earlier, the turbocharger no longer nerfs the damage by 1 per round, and because of this, you no longer need to have the choice between using the Havoc without a turbo and making it feel a little wonky, or having it easier to use, forcing you not to do as much damage. A Havoc at a level 3 mag brings 36 rounds to the table, which is massive for a gun with this fire rate, and this also means you have an incredibly large damage output per magazine that at times, and if used like an SMG, can be considered one of the best guns in the game. S tier for me are always the insane and must-use weapons or the top of the meta choices. There's quite a few, which also shows just how many options Apex Legends has when it comes to how you want to play. One I never thought I would rank on the top is the 30-30 repeater, but it's something that you can just not avoid. I don't think the repeater is as much of a must-have in pubs, but when it comes to ranked Apex, and even if you want to play slower in pubs, I don't think there's a better choice for pure damage output at that mid-range of 50 to 150 meters or even further. The 30-30 has a quick reload of 2 rounds at a time, which means less downtime and more damage output. It's easy to use, doesn't really require any attachments besides an optic, and it's very forgiving. Heavy ammo is easy to come by, and if all this wasn't enough, a skull piercer will make it even better. It doesn't have the same quick time to kill as an R9, but the Car SMG is also a straight up beast when it comes to Apex's meta. The Car SMG will actually outperform an R9 off the drop, as it does have a higher damage per mag, which can be pretty important. If someone finds a purple armor right off the drop, an R9 is not going to be able to kill them without a magazine. Not to mention, the Car SMG has always been that go-to weapon for pure flexibility, as you will never have an ammo problem, and being able to use either mag type means you'll have it kitted up faster than its competition. If you want something that is more forgiving due to the larger damage output per mag and per round, then the Car is the better option, but when it comes to that raw time to kill, there's still a better choice. Even with its 1 damage per round nerf, the Hemlock Assault Rifle is surprisingly still very good. We have absolutely transformed over the past 2 to 3 seasons into a burst meta, which I think is okay, as 301 Legends was reigning supreme for years, but if you do not like burst guns right now, then you are really in a tough spot. The one thing I actually like the Hemlock for over some of the other guns close to it is that the Hemlock in single shot mode is pretty deadly for those with a good trigger finger. If you do connect any of your bursts to the head, it is going to surprise enemies, as it can honestly 2 bursts at times, which is very hard to react to, as before you know it, 1 burst hits you, you're at 100 health, and then before you even have time to think, the second burst hits you and you're down on the ground. The only slight knock I will give to the Hemlock is its close range viability, but more than likely you're gonna have an R9 or a Car to back it up, and this won't be much of a problem. I have a few S plus or God tier weapons which I do want to discuss, which are without a doubt the best guns in the game. We will begin with the returnee to the care package, and it is the Prowler. I actually will start by saying that the Prowler in burst mode, if you don't know, is just better than the Prowler in full auto. Recoil is less, your TTK will be better as well. I mean, a 35 round SMG that can 1v2 or even 1v3 enemies at times, what more do I really need to say? It's in the care package for a reason, and its performance is absolutely that of a CP weapon. Every care package now has a gun in it, so if you do manage to find it fairly early on in a game, you will have a significant advantage. I definitely would not overlook this thing. It's insane. Like the old days of the longbow in season 1 and season 2, if you did not play back then, but you want to experience how things used to be, be. The wingman in the care package right now has never been closer to these days. If you are accurate with your shot, I do not think there is a better gun in the game right now. 50 damage body hits with around 100 or higher headshots is absolutely absurd when coming from a pistol with all that handling and mobility. It isn't easy to use for most, but honestly, you need to practice with it and learn it because it will be more than likely this way for the next 6 months of Apex. CP guns typically run for 2 seasons. I will also mention that the wingman can kind of be used in that mega close range like a shotgun. If you do have fairly good tracking, hip firing this pistol is pretty viable as it is very accurate. The top assault rifle for me this season, and the one I think most will find the easiest path to success, is going to be the Nemesis Burst AR. The Nemesis did not receive any nerfs like its Hemlock's counterpart, which honestly makes the decision way easier when it does come to figuring out which gun you should take. The Hemi is way better at conserving ammo, so this is one factor to be aware of, but there's no way around it. If you want the fastest killing mid-range gun, the Nemesis is going to be it. But much like ammo conservation, the Hemlock does have a slight added benefit of being more flexible at that mega long range with tap firing. And to the surprise of absolutely no one, the R99 is once again the best SMG in the game. Even with its nerf to the base in all magazine levels last season, it's still way too fast of a killer to not recommend. Its recoil is honestly simple and straight up, which helps as well, so if you are looking for the best competitive edge, look no further than the R9. Don't forget to check out this video right here for more ways to improve your skills in Apex. Hit that like button, and I will see you in the next one. Happy gaming, legends.